Fellow human beings, residents of planet Earth, that's probably a good example of what I mean by this automatic, instinctual kind of behaviour which is driven by everything that we've learned up to this point in time. Up until a few years ago, my typical way of sort of letting people know it's time to move on is I'd say, ladies and gentlemen. And that's clearly not the only two options that are available. But it's so habitual and instinctual, even the moment I stepped up into stage then, there was a part of me that was kind of saying, ladies and gentlemen, it's no. No, there's more versions, there's more classifications, there's more identities than that. But what do we share in common? Well, we all do reside on this planet called Earth. And sometimes it's easy to change some of our habits of thinking that produce our behaviour. And sometimes it's hard. And those moments are particularly when we're confronted with a version of ourselves that we didn't realise exists. Because the truth of the matter is that we view ourselves through memory. So we're in the moment, we do something, and then afterwards we think through what we remember that we did, and we often put a generous interpretation on it. I did that because I was trying to be helpful. We're less likely to put a less benign interpretation on why we do what we do. Other people, however, can give us feedback to let us know how we are really showing up. And that's incredibly helpful, if not sometimes painful. One of the CEOs in our history in Australia was very effective at transforming an organisation and transforming a very large system of things to be a real change maker was a fellow by the name of Paul Anderson. So during the 1990s, BHP was in a lot of trouble. They'd gotten quite confused about who they were. They'd been engaged in some stuff that wasn't very helpful to the world. And in terms of their business, their revenues were shot, their costs were high, and one of the big things that they had going on was very higher levels of fatality and injuries in the workplace. And they wanted to change things, so they hired a new CEO, Paul Anderson, who was a Texan, a very Christian, devout man. And he engaged with a large leadership team to try and turn the organisation around. And they made tremendous progress over a few years on revenues, on costs, so therefore profit, productivity. But the one metric that was stubborn, that wouldn't move, was fatalities, safeties and injury. It was really stayed high. And he believed deeply that those two things, profitability and productivity and safety, are not opposites. They can exist in the same space. And he believed deeply that no person should ever go to work and not go home, or go home having been harmed. And so he was so frustrated by the lack of movement in this area that he pulled all of the senior team together for a 2-day summit. And they spent 2 days examining the statistics and the data and the case studies and the insights, tried to work out what was going on and come up with answers. But at the end of the 2 days, he was starting to feel very frustrated because none of what they talked about seemed to really nail what was going on. And in this level of arousal, he says to the person who's responsible, the VP responsible for health and safety, come on, surely you know what's going on. Surely there's something that you know that you're not sharing. And this person looked at Paul and clearly made a decision in his mind and said, okay, Paul, you want to know what the problem is? You're the problem. Now, you can just imagine everyone in the room at this point in time. They're going, oh. He went on to say, so Paul, you're the problem because you ride your motorcycle out of the basement car park here at 20 kilometres per hour and the speed limit downstairs is 10. And people hear you on your bike doing that because it's a very loud Harley Davidson. And then when you ride out of the car park, you sometimes don't wear your helmet if it's a hot Friday afternoon. And now that might be okay in the jurisdiction that you come from in the US, but that's not the way we roll in Victoria. Helmet's mandatory. And when we go out to site, you don't wear the glasses, you don't wear the high vis, you don't wear the gear, you don't hold the handrails, you don't do all the things that we tell our people they should be doing. And they're all watching you. And you say safety is the most important thing. But you know what? It's always the last item on every agenda, which means we often don't get to it. So Paul, you're a big part of this problem. And he sat there. Now, I know this to be true because I've spoken to people who were in the room. There's also a Harvard Review article around this. He sat there, nothing on his face, just looking like this. You can imagine the tension building in the room, can't you? People are edging their chairs away, getting ready to get out of the blast radius. And after 30 seconds, he said, "You're right. That is what I do. And I haven't been thinking at all about the impact that that has. And I'm going to need to work out what to do with this. And I'm going to have to do something different because I accept that I'm playing this part." And you know what he did? He started riding his Harley at the correct speed out of the car park ramp. He always wore his helmet. Every time he went out to site, he wore the glasses, wore the gear. And he made, from that point forward, safety the number one topic in every meeting. In fact, from that time forward, BHP have built this culture, whereas the very first thing that gets spoken about in every meeting is what they do is what's called a safety share. It comes before everything else to bring their attention to safety. Now, it's an extraordinary example for me of how our behaviour changes the system around us. And how, however, what that requires is for someone to be willing to accept that there is a version of themselves that is different to the version that they hold to be true. That there's an experienced version of them that in fact might lead us to more insights about how we are really showing up and the impact that we have. And this is, I think, is part of the challenge, is to understand that if we just keep turning up the same way we've always turned up, the way that the world has taught us to turn up, and not examine our own behaviour, what we're going to do is we're going to operate in a reactive state. We're pretty much just going to react to the world as it is, just play our role within it and probably maintain the status quo. I've heard someone sharing at the table before about when you keep turning up the way that you do, nothing really happens. But when you try something different and turn up differently, suddenly the system shifts. One of the paradoxes is that people want us to be predictable as leaders. But you know, sometimes the most helpful thing is to actually be unpredictable for a moment. Do something different to what you would normally do. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But the difference between this level of leadership, just reacting to the system, maintaining the status quo, is to move to creative leadership, where what we do is we understand by interpreting the world differently and by acting differently, we can create the world in which we want to live. Now, I don't know about you, but I have this very, very deeply held sense that in many ways our world can be better than what it is. In so many ways. But the only person that I have any control over who could make a difference is me in this moment, right now. That if I could get you to expand your abilities as a leader in some way, or even just to put a little seed, like a grass seed in your sock, that will wear its way and annoy you until you finally do something to grow into the leader that you need to become, then maybe we can start to create the world in which we really want to live. But isn't that the work of leadership? Isn't that the promise of leadership, that the tomorrow that we create is a better world than the today that we live in? But if we're to do this work, we have to understand that we need to move beyond our identities. We need to challenge our identities. We need to start to be more than just that controlling or the intelligence or the relationships. And if we're going to do that, then we can say, well, no longer does this identity have a hold of me, I can hold it. Go, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that the way I've been programmed causes me to turn up this way? But I don't want to be that narrow. I actually want to be more than that. I want to author myself bigger than the script that has been written for me by the world. And if I do that, then maybe people might start to discern something different about my character, where I can be connected and relating, but I can also be very self-aware. I can be courageous when I need to be. And I can still be focused on making things happen, but it's not all about me making things happen, it's about us making happen what we want to make happen. And if that's the case, then maybe these behaviours start to become accessible to me. All of these catalyst, creative, extraordinary behaviours. If I can grow beyond the version of myself that I hold to be true right now to a bigger version of the truth, maybe I can be more of this more consistently, more often. And isn't that the challenge? How do we grow into the leaders that the world needs us to be? That our friends, our families, our teams, our communities, our organisations, our countries, just even fulfil my own potential. But if we're going to do that, what we need to understand is that we are not a machine. We can't just suddenly pull a part out and put a new part in. We can't just pull out a chip and put a new chip in. You don't just load a new app onto the system and it works. You are a living system. And living systems don't change like that. So what we've learned about living systems is that if you look at a system at any point in time and say, this is the results that the system produces, if you want a different result, what do you need to do? You need to change the system. That's logical. So if there's some aspect of my leadership which is less functional at the moment, it's producing results that I'm not satisfied with, I need to change how I show up. I need to change some aspect of me. But if I'm going to do that, how do living systems do it? Well, they do it by innovating. So they add something new into the system. But before they do that, they can serve a lot. So you are wonderful. You are amazing. You are functional. You are successful. And there's a huge amount of you don't want to change and probably doesn't need to change. But there's maybe a small part that if you were to innovate in a new belief, a new practice, a new mindset, a new way of thinking about the world, a new insight into self, a new technique, a new skill, a new behaviour, maybe that innovation would yield a disproportionate amount of advantage. So if you think about the difference, for example, between a chimpanzee and a human being, evolution has produced 3% difference in the DNA, only 3%. But the capacity of a chimpanzee to a Homo sapien is vastly different. So sometimes it doesn't need to be a lot in the living system to be innovated, just enough to unlock something. And that would be great, because it would be great to keep going to sessions where we learn new things and we say, oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to do that. Or watch a TED talk and, oh, I'm going to do that. Or go on a course, or I'm going to do that. Or talk to my boss and I'm going to do that. But you know what? You can't just keep adding. And the reason you can't keep adding is because there's usually going to be conflicts that are going to emerge. You might want to try something like curiosity. You genuinely want to actually be open and receptive and ask questions and listen, but there might be part of you which believes that there's no time. You might want to be compassionate and empathetic, for example, and bring that into your repertoire, but there might be part of you which says, well, in fact, we've just got to produce the results right now. So there's usually something that's going to get in the way. And so what we have to do is understand that to make way for the innovation, there's going to have to be some form of loss. Maybe we have to let go of a belief that's going to be in competition, or modify it, or let go of the way that we see the world, or let go of a habit that we find comforting because it's our go-to. We have to let go. We have to lose something. And here's what we know to be true about change, and you'll know this too. That even if you've got a brilliant idea, it's going to create loss for someone. And the loss causes the resistance. It's the real or the perceived losses that people's minds produce to that change that produces the resistance. And the same is true for you as well. So how do we make progress? Well, what we need to do is we need to understand that if we're going to make progress with the outside world that is us, we need to work on the inside world. And we need to grow beyond who we are today. So, for example, I'll go back. I've got a good example of this with a client that I had. He was an aspirant for a CIO role. He was very senior in a technology organisation. He was near the top. He wanted to become the Chief Technology Officer or the CIO. However, he was struggling. His boss had said to him, you just always need to have the right answer. You always need to be the one who has the answer. You always have to be right. And that's not kind of working well for other people. So you need to do something about it. So he came to me for executive coaching. And in the very first session, it felt he was reluctant to be there. I could tell that. He was only there because his boss had told him he needed to be here. And so we were talking it through and he was saying, yeah, I accept that I do, but I'm smart. My answers are often better than other people's answers. And we explored, well, what might an alternative behaviour be where he allowed sometimes other people's answers to kind of get the oxygen they need, and he didn't need to win all the time. And he started to go, yeah, I get that those behaviours would be helpful to me and probably would remove some of the barriers to me getting promoted. And I reckon, and I could see it in his eyes in that moment, he decided he didn't need executive coaching. He decided that by sheer will alone and intellect, he would go out there and behave differently. And so he said, thanks, Gerard, but no thanks. And off he went. Several months later, he sheepishly got back in contact with me and said, kind of, it seems like through sheer force alone and will, I haven't been able to make progress. So I said, that's fine, no worries. We just probably need to do some inner work. We need to make progress with this. But I also said to him, so tell me a little bit more about, does this behaviour show up elsewhere? And he goes, yeah, and that's part of the reason I'm here. He says, I've got 2 teenage daughters and I just keep telling them they're wrong. And effectively, that's what I keep telling them. And to be honest with you, he said, I want them to grow, I genuinely want them to grow to be empowered, strong women. That's what I want for them, to be able to step forth into the world. But I'm actually worried that I'm not doing that. I'm creating something different. And I'm also worried that that's going to affect my relationship with them, and I want to have a meaningful relationship with my daughters as they become adults. I said, great, let's do the work. Part of the work was understanding how his belief about being right had been formed. And it just so happens he was the son of a migrants who had very little money, but as the oldest son, we won't talk about the patriarchy, but as the oldest son, they had decided to invest in him to go to a private school, a boarding school, which cost them a bomb. But the expectation was that he was going to honour the sacrifice that the family made. And so he had to get good grades and he had to be right. And by the way, his father also had to be right all the time too, so he learnt that. And this is an identity that he carried, to be right, to always be right and to win. And he realised that there were some ways in which that was very helpful in his life, but there are other ways in which it was limiting. And that he needed to grow beyond that identity. And he did. Each of these identities, there's a way of making progress to grow bigger into something else, to not let go of who we are, but to become more. So we have these 3 different leadership identities of control and protect and relate. And each of them has the capacity to produce the reactive tendencies, the ordinary versions of leadership when we're not at our best. So control tightly controls, over-manages, micromanages, perfects. Protect argues, criticises, blame, resists, withdraws. And relate will often over-comply, avoids conflict, just tries to soothe and smooth things over, not comfortable, kind of holding the heat in conversations that's often necessary for really transformative outcomes to occur. To grow into creative leadership, the kind of behaviour that needs to start making an appearance are, so if we want to achieve things, rather than through just our own efforts, how do we do that through others? Or if we want to use our intelligence helpfully, how do we use our intelligence to actually, rather than have all the answers, actually, in particularly moments of not knowing, when none of us have the answers, to show genuine curiosity and be vulnerable enough to say that, I don't have the answers. Did anyone have a leader during COVID who said, I'm sorry, I just don't have the answers. I don't know the answer to this and I'm struggling just as much as you. It's empowering to know that you're dealing with a human being. And often that's accompanied with, but together we're going to find a way. We may not have the answers, but we can find the answers. So it's coupled with that curiosity in a sense of still being able to make progress. And the relate identity, which is to speak courageously and challenge and raise the heat and engage in productive conflict. So how can I not just go along with the system as it is today, but how can I do something that actually challenges us so we can do and be more? The question, though, is what needs to happen for this to occur. Now, I'm going to boil down 35 years of working with leaders and working on myself into 3 things that I've learned to be true for people to make progress beyond these identities. Because if you're going to say, where's the gold in all of this? This is this moment. Now. And what I believe to be true is it's not just about becoming more successful as a leader. It's actually about being able to meet the world. I don't know about you, but one of the challenges of being alive is that we're constantly confronted with these moments of suffering, challenges and difficulty. We don't want to acknowledge it often, but we do. We struggle with stuff. And what I'm interested in is helping connect to people where their suffering is, but allow them to grow beyond that. But the truth is, most of the time we create our own suffering by thinking we have to be in the world in a particular way. So to grow in leadership is not just to grow in leadership, it's to actually grow in life. So the critical adaptations in order to grow for those people who like to tightly control and over-control, it's just to let go. When are the moments where you need to take control, but when are the moments you need to let go? And trust. And trust others. And ask them to do the work. I don't know how many of us live these lives that is just so much is filled with stuff that we think we should be doing. Maybe we should not be doing it. I've also seen leaders who have made progress with this in many different ways, but if I talk about the chef, he is now, I read this on LinkedIn yesterday and I was so chuffed. I kid you not. I got off the plane, was waiting for a taxi, looked on LinkedIn and there's a post. So he went on to actually learn that rather than tightly control, he needed to empower others, he needed to let go, and he worked really hard on doing that. And then yesterday he put a LinkedIn post, or his company put a LinkedIn post. He now is the executive director of food and beverage for a very large collection of hotels. So he's got lots and lots of restaurants and teams. And he's just been awarded, he received this award for coaching and mentoring. He's transformed the way he approached things and created something of real value, both to himself and others. And I know through a conversation with him a year ago that he has a relationship with his family and his life that has more balance now. He still works hard. He's always going to work hard. But there's more balance now. And he's still married, by the way. To protect identity is about vulnerability through not knowing. How do I declare in this moment, I don't know? Well, my answer might not be the best answer. And that's okay. But if I could work out what are the few questions I could ask that would help us, then maybe that's even better. So my advice to leaders who are moving from expert roles into general management beyond, stop thinking about the answers you want to give and start thinking about the questions that you need to ask. It's much more powerful to have a few questions than all the answers. But that means you have to have moments to spend the idea that you should be the one who needs to give the answer, because that'll make you look smart and make you feel okay about yourself. Who here during COVID learnt to just let go, to not know, and to learn to be okay with not knowing what was going to happen next? And it probably made all the difference between how you came out the other side. And then so the client that I had, which is Pete was the CIO aspirant. I know I ran into him about 12 months ago. He was working with another organisation, but he's only working part-time now because he decided that he didn't want to be the CIO anymore. He said, because he had this idea that that there was a different way that he wanted to live in the world. And he works part-time now because one of his daughters has had a child and he wants to be able to look after that child so his daughter can go and work and start to live to her potential in her role. And he made that deliberate trade-off, that deliberate choice. And he started to create the world in which he wanted to live. And the third identity, which is the relate identity, how do we make progress? Well, we learn that sometimes we've got to have the courage to be disliked. The thing that stops us and holds us back from challenging the system, creating tension, having difficult conversations, is a deep sense that we might be disliked and no longer be wanted. Leadership is not a popularity contest. Sometimes you have to be prepared to be disliked to play the role that you need to live the purpose that your leadership is in service of, and get comfortable with conflict. Kay, the Vice President, she learned over time to hold herself in the conflict more effectively. She now works in a national sporting organisation. Her CEO is very powerful, both personally in terms of style, and she's now prepared to go into those conversations and create heat, hold heat. She said she still feels this nervousness here, like there's something at risk, but she still is prepared to consciously go in and do it. And this is, I think, probably the most important idea is that, and Gandhi knew this to be true, all the great leaders, the ones that we hold up to be credible, it's not that they were born as finished work as leaders, they did an incredible amount of work on themselves. I don't know if you know it, with Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, as an example, they all learnt together. They actually spent time together, learning together about leadership. So his statement was, that we all know is be the change you want to see in the world. And I think it's an incredibly powerful statement, but I don't think it's, in this moment, the most helpful one to us. During the whole struggle where he was seeking to lead the people of India out from colonial rule, he was asked by a journalist in his home village as they sat in the dirt. The question was, what's your greatest challenge? Now, anyone would have put money on the response being, my greatest challenge is to lead the people of India out from colonial rule. But that's not what he said. He said, my greatest battle lies within myself. The work's not out there. Start, you do the work here. So the question for you is this. In your tables, what is it you think you need to let go of? You don't need to do this instantaneously in terms of let go right now, because this might be lifelong work. But what is it you think you need to let go of in order for you to grow into the leader that you wish to become and need to become?